Hello and welcome back. It's officially winter in the Midwest. It's been snowing the last few days and I'm recording this video on December 1st. I'm getting all the Christmas feelings. I'm getting all the holiday excitement. I put some lights up on my bookshelf. I'll put a picture if you can't see it in this clip. As exciting as Christmas is and like with the holidays coming up, I wanted to talk about the books that I read from September all the way through November. And I actually did a really good job following the seasonal TBR that I did. There's a video of me talking about it here if you haven't watched it yet, but this video is going to wrap up everything not only on that list, but the additional things that I read, what audiobooks I read, everything that I consumed from those couple of months. Looking at my list, we're going to start in September. We're going to go in chronological order. I have my list here of all the books that I've read, so we're going to start in chronological order, beginning in September. The first book that I read in September was actually a reread, and the first time I read this book, I gave it a 4 stars. I thought it was really good, but this time around, I gave it a 5 star. Because in the span of when I read it in 2022 and until I reread it this past September, I could not stop thinking about it. I regularly thought about this book and the concepts and just like the whole idea that it was trying to portray. I definitely saw other like forms of media and other like shows, books, kind of like where I was like, oh, that reminds me of this book. Oh, that reminds me of this book. It still lives free in my brain, and I saw that my 2 local book clubs we're both reading the same book. So I, of course, being the nosy person I am, know that this book is very like polarizing. You either really, really love it or you despise it. And I wanted to know everyone's opinions, and I wanted to stand on my soapbox and talk about how much I loved it. That book is Tender as the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. This is a translated story, so I believe she's from Argentina. And as you can see, like I tabbed the heck out of this book. I had so much fun reading it. I literally sat down one day and like read 100 pages in one sitting, and I don't normally do that, but that's how good this book is. In this book, we follow a main character named Marcos, but the story's not really about him. It's more like what's happening around him. So in this world, there is like a news story that comes out that says that animals are no longer able to be consumed by humans because they've developed this poisonous virus, which means meat is no longer able to be sold and processed by people. So, you know, you would think that this was like some sort of like vegan or vegetarian propaganda and everyone was going to complain about that. No, people decide to turn to cannibalism. So this whole story is about cannibalism. It is, but it isn't centered around that. It's also a really, really interesting take on consumerism, capitalism, and how the government regulates these different things that affect like our nutrition in society. And it's also a depiction of like how we view animals, how we treat animals like from the beginning of their life to the end of their life, and it's really gruesome because Marcos works in a meat factory, but it's a human meat factory, essentially. So we follow his perspective and we kind of go from there. But this book, in my opinion, is very thought-provoking. I enjoyed it from start to finish, even more the second time. And this was like one of the first like horror books I ever read, but I would say this is more of like a literary horror, a speculative fiction with horrific elements. But this made me want to dive into the genre a bit more. I was about to say I have a taste for the genre, which seems about right, but I gave this book 5 stars, loved it. Next book on the list is one that I don't own physically, but I got it from the library and then read it for a virtual book club that I do where we read fantasy books with some of like my college friends, and that book was One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This is a perfect fall book. It's very like dark fantasy-esque. The writing is very atmospheric and like misty, and I loved the writing style. That's what really drew me in because it does feel like a dark fairy tale. It is one of those books where I went in with very low expectations, even though I know a lot of people were talking about it. This book is sometimes branded as romantasy or fantasy with romantic elements, and I didn't really know what to expect. So I just went in very open-minded, and I was very pleased with it. Our main character is named Elsbeth, and she's living in this world where people have survived from a fever, and if you survive from a fever, you sometimes inherit like these magical powers, and hers is that she has the soul of like a guy in her brain that she calls the Nightmare, and it's essentially like a parasite in her brain, nagging her constantly and making it really hard on her, but she has to keep this a secret because anyone who has those kinds of powers are sought out to be killed. But the main magic system in the book doesn't even revolve around that. It revolves around tarot cards, and there are 12 different tarot cards, and they go through like each of them and tell you about each of the powers of these tarot cards. The coolest part about it is anyone can use it, so there's no like power differential really. As long as you like tap it and you have intent, then you can use the card. But of course, there's not like a ton of cards to be distributed, but anyone can use them. I liked this story quite a bit. It's not like one of my all-time favorite fantasy stories, but I really enjoyed the characters, I enjoyed the magic, the atmosphere, all of that was great. At times I felt like it read more like young adult than like adult to me, even though this is like an adult fiction. But overall I thought it was good. I definitely wouldn't call this a romantasy book though, because it does focus on like the magic and the political aspects just a bit more than the romance. And I did read Two Twisted Crowns, which is the second book, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, overall, really enjoyed this. I would recommend this as like a getting into fantasy type book, and that was what one of my friends did. She like doesn't read fantasy at all, and this was her first like tiptoe into it, and she really enjoyed it. So yeah, Wonder Window. Next book for September that I read was a romance book, and I've read by this author before. I read The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. I was really looking forward to this book because the concept sounded interesting. I feel like that's a common thing with Ashley Poston's books, is like the concept sounds really interesting, but flimsy execution seems to be the other part of it. So The Dead Romantics is about Florence Day, and she grew up where her family like owned a funeral home. They worked in a funeral home. She was used to death, that sort of vibe. And like the main shtick of this is that she is working as a ghostwriter, and she's struggling to get her next book out because she's grieving over the loss of her father. And the love interest is actually the guy who's been assigned to be her new editor, but then he dies. And she's like, oh no, he's hot. And then he turns into a ghost, and it's a relationship between those two while he's a hot ghost and she's grieving over her dad. It sounds really messy. I promise you it is uninteresting. I wish that I had liked this book more. This was the second book I've read by Ashley Poston. I read a novel Love Story over the summer, and I did not like that book at all. This book, I at least really loved how the grief and family matters were depicted, and that's why I gave it a 3-star. But overall, I felt absolutely no spark between the two romantic leads, and it was just a little convenient how the ending wrapped up, in my opinion. I just don't have too much to say other than this is like a pretty forgettable romance in my eyes, and I'm hesitant to pick up another book by her just because I've had 2 strikes so far. I'm hoping something will change my mind. But the other thing that like bothered me just a little bit with this book is I love a quirky girl, but I feel like Ashley Poston does it to the next level. Like, this person was unironically saying zoom zoom juice and doggo and all the like real bad cringe stuff we said in like the early 2010s, and if it didn't fit because I know the book was published like a few years ago too, so it was just one of those things where it fully brought me out of the story. And this girl was supposed to be like way older than me even too, and I was like, I don't believe you would talk that way. But yeah, gave the book 3 stars. Pretty forgettable, little bummed out, great depictions of grief, and a hot ghost if you're interested. The next book that I read is for sure on my favorites of the year, and I have a vlog about it too. If you haven't seen it, it's my first vlog, which is, it's pretty bad, honestly. No, I need to be nice to myself. But it was my first vlog. I'm proud of myself for doing it. But this book is Blue Sisters by Coco Malors. I'll just start off by saying this was easily 5 stars. The writing in it was absolutely incredible. Descriptions, the depiction of grief, the talk about sisterhood. The part that got me the most was she connected addiction to like chronic pain, and that just resonated so deeply within me, especially because a lot of the chronic pain that we talk about is invisible pain, and it's related to like reproductive health and whatnot. And it was done in such a way where, oh my gosh, I had to close the book at one point because I was like almost in tears from how like raw and emotional the descriptions were about this pain. And it's even harder too because I should probably talk about what the book is about before I keep waxing poetic, but The Blue Sisters follows 4 sisters. It follows 3 perspectives. It's Avery, Bonnie, and Lucky, and then the 4th sister, Nikki, is talked about through those 3 perspectives. This is not a spoiler, it's on the back of the book, but Nikki has just recently passed away, and they're following the sisters 1 year after, and they're still grieving in their own unique ways. So we're following the different sisters, and we're seeing how the perspectives connect, the disconnect, and just the depictions of like their relationships regrowing and reforming after this death, grieving and the different ways that they do, and how they've been navigating like their familial trauma. They had a lot of trauma with their mom and their dad, but they've always had this like tight bond. And Coco Malors just writes in such a really, really emotional way that I love so much. It destroys you in the best way possible, and her books are gonna be like auto reads for me. Like I'm definitely gonna buy Blue Sisters, the paperback, once it comes out. And I read Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Malors earlier in the year, and I really enjoyed that as well. We dive into characters so deeply where you understand every facet of them, and that's what I love the most about the writing. But Blue Sisters is just something special. Like if you haven't voted on Goodreads for it, and there's still time, you need to do it. It was absolutely incredible. For sure gonna be one of my top 5 favorite books of the entire year, but I loved it. And the last book that I got to in September was for the Sapphic Book Club that I attend in real life, and that book was This Is How You Lose the Time War. So I have some complicated feelings about this book because 1, it didn't make sense, and 2, the discussions we had at book club were either like people raving about it or people like absolutely hated it, and there was like not a ton of middle ground. Like the people who got it then were also like, oh, you just didn't get it. The book doesn't make sense, but that's part of the fun. Once you understand that it's not going to make sense, then it's a great time. Like the writing is objectively beautiful, and the story is like a science fiction story, and you're following 2 agents on opposite sides of the same time war. There's red and then there's blue. So blue kind of like represents the more like naturalistic side of things, whereas like red is more of like the technology focused point of view that we get, and they only understand each other because they're in similar situations. So I think the plot of the book was trying to stop this time war if they could, or they were like writing letters back and forth to each other. I'm not sure what the overarching plot was. I gave this book like 3.5 stars, but it was still fun to discuss because you could get different things out of it depending on how you read the book. But this is not one that I want to revisit because I spent too much of the book trying to understand it and did not. But it was still an interesting and like super quick read. Like it was very fast to get through. But if you like very experimental fiction, you might really enjoy this. But jump into what I read in October. Starting off, I started a new audiobook series that I've seen a lot of people rave about, and the book in question is Curious Beginning by Deanna Raybourn. It's part of the Veronica Speedwell series, and so we follow Veronica, and she's a naturalist. So she like a natural scientist, you know, she's intrigued by flowers and bugs and plants, and she's got like a little net and does that. And like she loses someone close to her, and because of this, it propels a plot that someone's after her, and she has to stay with this guy named Stoker, who's also a naturalist, but he's kind of like grumpy and blah blah blah, but she's also kind of like, I only want to talk about what I want to talk about, and they have like their hyperfixations and they're very similar, but they butt heads a lot, and the banter is absolutely the best part of it. I also really love the setting of the series too. It's very like 1800s, like the big dresses and like the old school technology. It's really fun. Just the way that Deanna Raybourn writes how they speak to each other and like to other characters, it's absolutely fantastic. This is just fun. I think there's like 9 books in the series right now, so it's just something you can enjoy and like binge through really. I started the second book, but then I got sidetracked by some other things, so I had to put it down for now. But I think I'll probably listen to this whole series on audio because the audiobook narrator was pretty good. I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to learn more about Veronica and Stoker because they're both really interesting characters. But I gave this book 4 stars. Next up was a book that I was also vlogging about in the Oddly Similar series vlog, and this book was actually recommended by a coworker of mine. It was not on my radar like at all really, other than I had read the premise of it like almost a year ago. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll put it on my list. And then never got to it, but then my coworker raved about it so much that I, being the curious person I am, had to pick it up and find out what was going on. So Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano is a Little Women retelling, and I still have not read Little Women. I feel like I probably will at some point in my life. But it was following 4 sisters, generational trauma, yada yada yada, and I was like, wow, that sounds like Blue Sisters, so that's why I made that vlog. But this story is not only about those 4 sisters and the relationships, but it's also about one of their like husbands, and he was a really interesting character. The story is just like a character study, a multi-generational story with multiple perspectives. Like we followed 2 of the sisters and then the husband, so William, Julia, and Sylvie, and we kind of find out about like their lives, how they view the world, and like what kind of things they have to deal with. But I really enjoyed this story. It was one of those stories where I felt like I had to analyze every single line because there was just so many intricacies like throughout the text. It was very, very well written, and I'm glad that I did spend the time with it. I gave this book 4 stars, and I didn't enjoy it quite as much as Blue Sisters, but I liked both of them quite a bit. This next one will be very brief and short, but in the fantasy virtual book club that I'm part of, we read this middle grade book called Over the Woodward Wall, mostly because it's similar to Over the Garden Wall in the name, and the gals that I, hang out with love that show. I still haven't watched it, but I really want to. And this was just okay in my eyes. I think if I was a little bit younger, I would have enjoyed it, but it read like young middle grade, like younger than Percy Jackson, and I still love that series, but it was cute. I like the overarching themes that were part of it, which was like, creativity and being different than one another doesn't necessarily mean anything. There was a good sense of adventure throughout and very creative like worlds and concepts, and I love I think it's portal fantasy where you get transported to another place. It was a cute little story. It's probably something that I would recommend to a 5th or 6th grader. They would probably really, really enjoy it. We follow the 2 characters. I think one of them is named Avery, I don't know, something with an A, and then something with a C. Obviously this book didn't stick with me too much, but it was cute. It was fine. It's whatever. That's kind of where I'm at with it. Now, next book though is one that I sped read and I enjoyed it so much. This is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. It is a debut horror novel following a Korean-American girl named Jiwon and her mother and sister. So the whole premise is that their dad leaves them, and then her mom, who's not emotionally stable at the moment, starts dating this really terrible white dude. And he's like the truck yeah kind of white dude, where he thinks he's very cultural competent and he just has no common sense whatsoever. But he kind of like fetishizes the Asian women throughout this story. He's really gross. He was like infuriating to read about, but it's sad because I've known people like that too. And we're following Ji-won's perspective in this story, and she's trying to, you know, navigate poverty, family issues, this creepy dude, this creepy friend that she's dealing with, and then she's also in university. She's dealing with like the issues of like an old friend group, you know, like all these sorts of things are changing in her life, and it's a lot of change all at once. Instead of seeking professional help, she decides to have a feminine rage moment where she's gonna start eating eyeballs, which it sounds deranged, and it is a little bit, but the whole story is like a slow descent into madness for this character, and it's very like character focused, which is why I liked it so much. It's just so funny though, because her mom always said like when you eat fish, like the eyes are the best part, and like you have to have like the eyeball even though it's weird. And then Ji-won, the main character, realizes that her mom's boyfriend has like really delicious looking eyeballs, like these big blue eyes, and she like hyper fixates on them, has dreams about them. It's really like weird, and like the story is a little bit predictable as you go on, but the writing is what's the interesting part, and like being directly inside her brain and seeing these thoughts firsthand. Her actions are absolutely like crazy at times too, and you don't want to chalk it up to her going through it, but at the same time like she's like a really really bad person, and you get to follow this train wreck over and over. But I gave this book 4.5 stars. I voted for it for best debut, and then for the horror category as well. Next book that I read was an audiobook, and this book wasn't necessarily on my radar. It was one of those things where I decided to check and see what Libby had instantly available on audio, and it was, so I figured I would give it a try. And that book is Chain Gang All-Stars. This is like a sci-fi dystopian type book where people who go to jail or are incarcerated are able then to fight in these gladiator-style battles for, like, towards their freedom, and you have to win a certain amount to be free. And it's a commentary on how a lot of these people who are incarcerated are usually people of color, and they come from really, like, rough backgrounds, and they have to, you know, like, they commit these crimes because of the situations that they're put in. That was a lot of the commentary, and the commentary on how we treat people who are incarcerated, how the media gets involved with people that are like professional athletes, because that's what a lot of these like Chain Gang All-Stars is what like the, you know, fighters are then called. That's what a lot of them are then perceived as. There's a whole bit about sports betting, and there was like, they scraped the surface a little bit talking about how we can use our voices to bring awareness to these issues, but I feel like that part was just a little underdeveloped, and I really didn't love the ending of this story. I feel like the stakes were always really, really good throughout. Like, the stakes always felt high, and like some of the characters were interesting to follow, but I feel like we really didn't dive into too much about the characters. We got a little bit of like their backstories and like how they got to where they are now, but it still wasn't like, but overall, I don't know, I'm just, the way that I think about the story is, man, I wish I liked it more, rather than, wow, that was so profound. And that's unfortunately where I'm at. After that, I read another disappointing book, but this one hurt on another level. And that book is none other than Somewhere Beyond the Sea by T.J. Klune. I gave this book 3 stars, but it doesn't feel like a 3-star book. I'm very sad because when I was reading this book, I enjoyed like the first 100 pages of it. It had all of the same magic and whimsy as the first House on the Cerulean Sea book, but as it started to progress, things got a little out of hand in the sense that, oh, well, first off, House on the Cerulean Sea is about our main character Linus, and he's like a social worker for magical children. So he opens this case where he goes to an island and meets the head of the household, which is Arthur. And Arthur's watching over like these few children, and they're all like very different magical children, but they're all adorable, and it's like a found family story, and it's a cozy, magical, good time. But the second book was a little infuriating in the sense of, without giving like spoilers, it felt almost too easy for the characters at time, and they could just say whatever they wanted, and it felt like they made the stakes super high in the beginning and then the stakes fizzled out as time went on. A lot of like the other side characters that weren't part of the core group felt like caricatures, and there wasn't a lot of nuance in the discussions that it was bringing up. It was very on the nose with a lot of things, and it actually like frustrated me reading the book because we repeated some of the same things happening over and over and over again, and it left me feeling like, what was the point of this book necessarily? The last book that I read, I actually got as a birthday gift to myself with a gift card, and that's Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio. If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio was my favorite book of last year. I enjoyed it so much. Full cast of characters. It was pretentious. It was Shakespearean inspired, and it was like a mystery. I loved it. Very dark academia. This book is very different. It's a novella, very short, and I feel like this is just the appetizer for the book that's going to come out next year from M.L. Rio. But Graveyard Shift is about these 5 like nighttime workers. They're working the graveyard shift, and they meet up in this cemetery so they can all smoke cigarettes because they can't in like the areas that they work. But they all work different jobs. They see someone dumping things into a grave, like an open dug grave, but the graveyard hasn't been used in years. So they take it upon themselves to get to the bottom of the situation and to, solve the mystery. I gave this book 3 stars because it took, like, for a novella, it took a while to even get into and get invested, but then I was so invested that I was, like, flipping through the pages so quickly, and then it just ended. It was such an abrupt ending, slow start, abrupt ending, and, like, the pacing was all out of sorts, but the ideas in it were so interesting. The full cast of characters was also interesting. Everybody was pretty distinct, which I enjoyed. Obviously, like, M.L. Rio's writing and vocabulary is incredible, but I definitely think that I want a full-length novel from her instead. Like, this was okay, but I don't know if I would ever go back and read it again. Maybe I'll try the recipes that were in the back of the book, because that's pretty cool. But yeah, I was a little disappointed with this one as well. Going into the last month, I really did a good job of knocking out some of the books on my fall reading list, and then I also snuck a reread in, which made me very happy, and then one of my favorite books of the entire year came out of November as well. First, I'll start with the reread. I reread Vicious, and I finally got some of the tabs in, and this is by V.E. Schwab. It is a story about Victor Vale and Eli Ever, and they're academic rivals, and it's very X-Men-esque in the way where they figure out if you have a near-death experience, you can sometimes give yourself superpowers, which sounds like a crazy concept, but it's really cool. They both are highly motivated, but motivated by different things, like polar opposite things. Like, Eli is very, like, religious. He's like a religious fanatic, and he sees it upon himself to cleanse the people that are, like, not seen in God's image in his eyes. And then Victor Vale is trying to stop Eli, because what happens in this book is Victor Vale, his perspective starts 10 years after he breaks out of prison. So they're both not good people, but in different ways. And it's like cat and mouse game energy towards each other. They're just like obsessed with each other because they're like, whoa, I love your brain and the way that you think. I feel like I want to spend a little bit more time with it because I did get busy and I was not able to annotate the second half of the book. But the first half of the book is like some of my favorite literature I've ever read though, because I did not even notice the page numbers. I was just going and going and going, and the story was so interesting, and I love the way that V.E. Schwab writes. This took me back to when I was 18 years old and I was first really getting into reading, and this book reminded me of why I love to read so much. Next up was one of the biggest surprises that I've had all year, and that book is The Project by Courtney Summers. I've been putting off reading this book since 2021. I bought it on release day because I loved Sadie so much by Courtney Summers. Courtney Summers is still one of the YA authors that I will read, but this book genuinely surprised me, and I read it at the perfect time. I'm glad that I did, and I'm glad that I can, check off another book that I've read on my list. But this story deals with cults. So it's about two sisters, and after a very traumatic accident where they lose their parents and one is severely injured, one of them gets wrapped up in this cult because she swears that the cult leader brought her sister back to life. And then it's the sister who's kind of a journalist trying to figure out more about this group called the Unity Project, which is the cultish group, but it's not exactly a cult is what a lot of the people are saying. And then she gets sucked into it, and just the language around cults was the most interesting part of this story. How the charismatic leader draws you in, and talking about how you kind of lose your sense of self when you get drawn into areas like this. I think the media coverage aspect of it was really interesting too, and obviously it's a story about sisters trying to find each other again, but I thought the mystery was good. It gets really dark for a YA book too, which I appreciate that Courtney Summers doesn't stray away from that. But I think I read this at the perfect time because a week before I started this book, I had watched the movie Let's Start a Cult, which is the movie that comedian Stavros Halkias wrote, and I love him. He's very funny. But that was kind of a tongue-in-cheek, silly movie about cults, but you can still see how the language was used. And in my brain, I was comparing the tactics in that movie to the leadership tactics in this book, and it was so interesting. So now I'm obsessed with the language that's used by cult leaders. But I gave this book 4 stars. It was a little bit slow for me to get into, but it was just setting the story up with the two sisters and their relationship, and then it dove into everything else after that. The next book that we're going to talk about, I'm so excited to talk about it because this was a surprise to me. I had seen people talk about it. I didn't know it was going to resonate with me in the way that it did. This book is Shark Heart by Emily Quebec. This book is so beautifully devastating. That's the best way to describe it. I didn't think I was going to love it as much as I did, but I got lost within the pages of the story. I wrote so many notes about this book because it's just an interesting depiction of love over time, love over challenges, and it broke me in so many ways. It's not only just about partnership love, but familial love, and oh my gosh, it was so heartbreaking, and it was so good. I couldn't put it down. I read it over the course of one weekend. I also really loved the conversation about how time is relative, and it's oh yeah, I have time to do that in my life, oh yeah. But we follow 2 main characters, and the main character Lewis finds out that he's going to turn into a great white shark, and it's a metaphor for a terminal illness that's pretty aggressive. And so not only does it depict how your body changes and how the pain is exemplified, but it's also about how your life is going to change and how people change the way that they treat you and how your relationships change. And it's just so sad. The writing in it is just so beautiful, and it's just an interesting description on chronic pain, terminal illness, loving someone, and life is always change. But this book is also pretty experimental because some of the pages are really short. Some of it is written a stage play too, and then some of it is so they'll have the different characters' names on the side over there, and yeah, so part 2. I'll have the character's name there. But it's such a quick and easy read to get through. The perspectives are interesting. The characters are very fleshed out. Like, this book came out last year, and I'm so sad I didn't read it till now, but I'm so glad I did read it. It's just incredible. I highly recommend it. I gave this book 5 stars. It's gonna be on my favorites of the year. I have so many notes about it. Then I'll talk about it pretty quickly, but this was the second book in the Shepherd King duology, Two Twisted Crowns. I didn't love this book as much as I liked One Dark Window, but the romance in this book, there's like a B-plot romance. It's better than like the original romance. Like, that part of it was so good. I thought that the like political intrigue and everything away from Elsbeth, the main character, was actually like more interesting. All of like the side plots and whatnot were the best part of this book. One thing that does fall flat for me is I didn't love how this book ended. I felt like it was one of those things where it's like, no one thought of doing that in 500 years? Okay. But this book kept the same like atmosphere and vibe and writing style as it did in the first book. We just focused more on like other characters and got a little bit more of the world lore. I would give this book maybe like 3.5 stars, but still like an overall good duology. I enjoyed both of the books. One of those where I would recommend it for people like starting out, and I wouldn't say it's like one of the best things I've ever read in my life. But Barnes & Noble does have some pretty cool special editions of these 2 books, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't tempted to get them. The last book on this wrap-up is another book that I was a little surprised at loving so much the more I got into it. That book is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chachki, which was also on my list of fall reads. I'll go through the list and like actually tell you how many of them I read. But this book follows the perspective of the bridegroom and then the main character Indigo's friend Azure from back in the day. But basically, Indigo has this very mysterious past, and she tells her husband, like, I'll marry you, but like you can't ask anything about my past. And he's all like, okay, because she's very beautiful and alluring and yada yada yada. And then once someone close to her in her past life is like slowly dying, they have to go back to the house that she grew up in, and they have to face a lot of her past. This story is a perfect modern gothic story. Like, the house definitely feels like it's alive, and as a character, the atmosphere and like the descriptions were so interesting. Like, a lot of the descriptions were around like juices and fruits and flowers and very natural things, but it also had like a haunting bit to it. It felt like reading a like Brothers Grimm fairy tale at times, and the relationship between Azure and Indigo was very interesting. I also kind of loved like the whole commentary on like Mean Girls too. Like, that was so surprising to me that that was one of the main like takeaways that I got from it. But like being your own independent person and like knowing yourself outside of others and like your own personal autonomy was really interesting, but also like manipulation tactics and wanting to fit in and being seen as beautiful and desirable and yada 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 was also super interesting. Like, I really, really loved Azure's perspective in this. I also partially listened to this book on audio. The audio was also fantastic. It's the same narrator, like the guy's point of view. It's the same narrator that does Strange the Dreamer, and his voice is just like royal in quality. So good. For this book, I gave it 4 stars. And it's like, it's a book that I feel like could be a classic someday. Like, it was really good. But I wouldn't say like it's a fantasy book. I feel like it's more magical realism type story, or just like a dash of fantasy. Out of the 13 books that I did put on the list, I read 8 of them. So that's pretty good. Yeah, I read Graveyard Shift, The Project, Vicious, Last Tale of the Flower Bride, Blue Sisters, Somewhere Beyond the Sea, Eyes Are the Best Part, Dead Romantics. And then I did actually get to start The Near Witch, which, I don't know if I'm going to continue with it though, because it just doesn't feel like the time to read it now. And I keep putting it off and I feel bad, so it's kind of like a softie enough for now. I'm very happy with everything I got through this fall. I felt like it was a very good reading season, and I'm excited to kind of see what winter brings next. I surprised myself, honestly, by sticking to the seasonal TBR and then allowing myself to have a little bit more freedom to pick up audiobooks and book club books and what I wanted to read. So I'll probably keep doing things similar to that, even though I do know the wrap-ups get a little lengthy at times. So that's kind of what I'm trying out for now. But if you made it this far into the video, thank you for spending some time with me. My name is the same on Instagram, Pages and Pastimes. Follow me over there. And leave a comment below of the favorite book that you read this fall season. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you with another video soon. Bye!